The Dallas Cowboys have tons of moves they need to make. This is the biggest offseason I think the Dallas Cowboys have had in quite some time, and with so much relying on this upcoming season, can the Dallas Cowboys make the proper steps to be the team we think they can? Well, today, let's talk about that. So I have created a list of 5 things the Dallas Cowboys need to do, and in my opinion, if they do these 5 things, they might be on the right track to going to where they want to be. So before we get into those 5 things, I think it is important that we at least talk about the season the Dallas Cowboys had. Now, I've already talked about the Dallas Cowboys in quite some detail in other videos, but I thought I'd come back to this topic because I do think there's 5 things that I do believe could fix this team long term. This most recent season, all things considered, was pretty successful. Micah Parsons was a Defensive Player of the Year candidate, CeeDee Lamb was an Offensive Player of the Year candidate, and so was Dak Prescott, who was also an MVP candidate. Now, you got 12 wins, but you didn't get any wins in the playoffs, and I think that is the biggest concern for Cowboys fans moving forward. Cowboys fans realize that they can win 12, 13, 14 games even in the regular season, but when it comes down to the playoffs, can they actually be the team that we think they can be? And I think there's good reasons for Cowboys fans to feel a little bit concerned. They haven't really done anything to get to that point quite yet. And in my opinion, they don't really have any excuses. They have the guys from quarterback to receiver to offensive line to defense to get to the job done. But they haven't. And I think moving forward, the number one priority has to be fixing the small issues to make the big problem much smaller. Hopefully that makes sense. Basically what I'm trying to say is the Dallas Cowboys have small issues they need to fix, and if they fix those small problems, I think they could be really good next year. In fact, even if they don't fix their problems, they have the guys and the coaching staff to be competent next year and maybe win a playoff game or 2. But unfortunately for Cowboys fans, winning 1 playoff game, 2 playoff games isn't enough. The job has to be to either get to the Super Bowl or at least the NFC Championship game, and if they don't do so, there's going to be some firings coming very soon. So let's actually hop into the top 5 things I think the Cowboys need to do moving forward. The number one thing, and I'm going to be screaming this the entire offseason, the Dallas Cowboys have to get more weapons offensively. As it sits right now, the Cowboys only have 1, maybe 2 genuine weapons, and that's Jake Ferguson and CeeDee Lamb. Outside of that, Tony Pollard did not look the same, Brandon Cooks was just alright, Michael Gallup, give me a break. And even though Dak Prescott is a good enough quarterback to go out there and contend with average play, I think overall it's very obvious that he needs to have more help on this offense, mainly, in my opinion, from the running game. Last year, Tony Pollard barely made it over 1,000 yards, and let's be honest, he made 5 yards over 1,000 yards in a 17-game span. That's not very good. And if you're the Dallas Cowboys, you need more from this running game. So I think the number one thing you have to do this offseason, get more running backs on this roster. And I'm not saying you got to get rid of Tony Pollard. I think he's a good enough running back that he deserves to be on the roster, but what I am saying is this: I think they need to go out there and get more of a traditional running back, a guy like a Derrick Henry or a Jonathan Brooks or somebody along those lines. So that way Tony Pollard can go back to being that 1-2 combination type of guy who can go out there and get you a big play here and there and can also be more of that passing guy. If they can do that, I think moving forward they're going to have a nice running game that they can rely on when Dak Prescott isn't necessarily having the best days. And we saw that be a real problem against teams like San Francisco and Buffalo and of course Green Bay. They didn't really have a run game to rely on. So Dak Prescott had to make all the plays, and when he wasn't making the plays necessary, they lost. And they lost typically pretty bad. So moving forward, I think the number one goal for the Dallas Cowboys has to be addressing the running back room. Again, I don't think Tony Pollard has to be fired necessarily. I think they should bring him back on a small term deal, but I think you got to get somebody else in the backfield to help him out. Next up, I think wide receiver is a huge need for the Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb is a great wide receiver, but he can't do everything by himself. Look at the Minnesota Vikings and what they did to Justin Jefferson going out there and getting a guy like Jordan Addison. Now, obviously that didn't really work out for the Minnesota Vikings, but that was because, well, they had no run game and the defense was not really great until Kirk Cousins got injured. So for Dallas, I don't think you want to make the same mistakes as a team like Minnesota. Go get you a running back, go get you some other wide receiver option. I think there should be plenty of wide receiver options in the first or second round of this draft who can come in and be an instant impact guy. In my opinion, if you can have CeeDee Lamb at the number 1, Brandon Cooks as the number 2/3, and then this new rookie wide receiver who can come in and be that number 2 or 3 guy. I look at a guy like Troy Franklin, Keon Coleman, and Adonai Mitchell and think those guys right there are 3 great options to put next to CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Cooks. They're big, they can make contested catches, and they're decent route runners all things considered. I think those guys should be on the Dallas Cowboys next year, or of course at least one of them. The number 2 thing I think the Cowboys need to do is figure out the defense, mainly at the linebacker position. The Dallas Cowboys have been a traditional man coverage unit relying on turnovers and Micah Parsons making plays, but I think the days of the Dallas Cowboys relying on their stars defensively should be over. Obviously the injury to Leighton Vander Esch really hurt the Dallas Cowboys linebacking room this year at the end of the day, they really only had one true linebacker that was healthy the entire season. Damone Clark was the only true linebacker, and he's really nothing special. Marquise Bell did fill in a role, but he's a converted safety, so he obviously doesn't have the size to be a good run stuffer. And when it came down to it, against teams that knew how to run the ball, like the Niners, like the Bills, and the Packers, they were able to expose that flaw of the Dallas Cowboys. And people such as myself were saying that Micah Parsons could be moved back to linebacker from time to time because I think he can help that problem, but Dallas obviously doesn't want to take him off the defensive line because, well, he's super dominant as a defensive lineman. So I think next year your big goal should be to go out there and get somebody who can stuff the run as a pure linebacker. Ideally, you'd like to find somebody who can stuff the run as well as play pretty good in pass coverage, but it's really hard to find those guys. But if you can find one of those guys, I think you do it. There should be plenty of guys in the draft and free agency. I know Dallas doesn't really have the money nor maybe the draft capital to go out there and get somebody, but this is not really a linebacker class that is particularly special. Jeremiah Trotter, Edrin Cooper are probably your number one and number two guys. I like Peyton Wilson as well from NC State. I think that could be somebody that Dallas does target. I think Dallas has the guys who are good enough in coverage. Again, Marquise Bell is a really good coverage linebacker. He's just not really good in stuffing the run because he's a converted safety. So if you can get somebody out there who can play on first and maybe second down, that's great. I think if you do that, that really does help out this Dallas Cowboys defense a ton because you already have a special defensive line. You already have Deron Bland, Trevon Diggs, three decent safeties who didn't really play all that great this year, so maybe you want to address that somewhat, but I think the linebacker position should be the number one thing the Dallas Cowboys look to address this offseason. The next thing, and it's the last thing I have for personnel-wise, it is my third biggest need for the Dallas Cowboys, and to me, it's going to be fixing small issues on the offensive line. Right now, as it sits, Tyron Smith and Tyler Biadasz might be leaving the Dallas Cowboys, and if that's the case, that's going to create some huge voids for this Dallas Cowboys offensive line. Tyron Smith, despite being very injury-prone these past couple seasons, had his most healthy season in quite some time, and he played pretty damn well, all things considered. Now, yes, he missed a couple games this year, but when he was playing, it wasn't like he was getting exposed. He was still the same old Tyron Smith we know, so I think moving forward, Dallas should try to give this guy a decent-sized contract for the next 2 to 3 years. I think the center position is a little bit more interesting. Tyler Biadasz has been a Pro Bowl level center, but I don't really know if he's had Pro Bowl level performance yet. I think he's decent in pass coverage, and I think he's decent as a run blocker, but as a pure center who's going to go out there and block the biggest guy, I don't know if he really is that guy. He's not a Travis Frederick or a Jason Kelsey. He's just kind of okay. And for Dallas, that's fine if he wants to come back for a small-term deal, or maybe not a small-term deal, maybe a long-term but cheap deal, but I don't know if he's really going to go out there like that. I'm sure there'll be plenty of teams that be willing to give him a decent-sized contract, so I wonder if Dallas is really going to be able to bring him back. If Dallas can't bring back a guy like Tyler Biadasz, that could end up being a bigger problem than people might think. I know there's some really good centers out there like Jackson Powers-Johnson in this year's draft, but I have a feeling that he might go higher than what the Dallas Cowboys pick in this year's draft. So if they were to lose out on a guy like Jackson Powers-Johnson, they got to have a contingency plan somewhere in line for that center position. Ultimately, I do think Tyler Biadasz will be back on the Dallas Cowboys, and I think if that's the case, that's not necessarily the worst case scenario for the Cowboys. So now we go on to a little bit less of the personnel thing and more to do with the team identity. And I think moving forward, there has to be a lot more accountability going on this football field. To me, personally, I think Dak Prescott is one of the best leaders inside the NFL. I think that he's one of those quarterbacks who can lead a group of men to battle any given night. But I think the outside pieces like Micah Parsons and CeeDee Lamb have got to be better with being a bit more accountable. Obviously, we know Micah Parsons has been doing his podcast, and I think one of his recent guests in CeeDee Lamb had a really good thing to say. He said that there needs to be more accountability from him, and I truly do think that is the case. We're talking about a guy who just had 1,700 receiving yards and is talking about he needs to fix himself. I do respect that, and I think CeeDee Lamb has a good idea of moving forward what he needs to improve upon. CeeDee Lamb needs to be more of that leader type of guy, and while I think Micah Parsons has done a decent job, I don't really know if he's done a good enough job at being that true leader. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with going out there and being a podcaster like Micah Parsons is doing. At the end of the day, go get your bag while you have the chance, so I don't really blame him. We see plenty of guys like Paul George do it as well. But what I am saying is I think that there needs to be a certain level of accountability from everyone on this team. Right now, it feels like everyone's just playing because they're a Dallas Cowboy and they're getting paid. They need to go out there and make plays so they can actually make genuine championship runs. I'm not saying the Cowboys have no aspirations to be champions. I think they all want to win a championship, but in my opinion, there takes a certain level of accountability that you see from teams like Kansas City and San Francisco to get to that point in making a Super Bowl run, whereas Dallas hasn't really had that same level of accountability. In my opinion, if Dallas does get that accountability, then maybe they could take the next step. At the end of the day, you're going to need that personnel changes I talked about, but you're also going to need a certain level of a change of accountability within yourself. And if they can do that, I'd feel a little bit better about the Dallas Cowboys. Obviously, I'm not in that locker room, so I'm kind of just speaking out of my own ass here, but in my opinion, if they do fix those problems, I think that could be a nice upgrade from what we saw this most recent year. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about today, it is my 5th biggest fix for the Dallas Cowboys. In my opinion, there has to be a little bit of a stop to being too fancy. I think the Dallas Cowboys need to go back to that identity of being a smash mouth team. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you take away everything you did last year and just throw it all away. I thought there were some really good things offensively and defensively from the Dallas Cowboys, but in my opinion, there has to be more smash mouth style of play from this Dallas Cowboys team. It feels like they're a little bit afraid to hit guys right now, and to me, that's a bit of a problem. I think if you go out there and get a truly good traditional running back, that could really help your problems out, because I think the Cowboys are built to be more of a smash mouth team. I just feel like they haven't really had the personnel to do so, especially last year. If you go out there and get a traditional running back and a traditional downfield run stuffing linebacker, that could really help you guys out and stop being a little bit too fancy. I felt like last year they were doing a little bit too much to try to fix certain problems, like Marquise Bell-out linebacker. So I think for the Dallas Cowboys moving forward, I think being a little bit too fancy sometimes can hurt you, but it can also be a good thing at certain points. I think there has to be a good balance for the Dallas Cowboys that they need to figure out pretty fast. And the next thing I think the Dallas Cowboys coaching staff needs to learn to develop is some rhythm starters for this offense. It felt like against really good teams, when Dallas wasn't really able to get their rhythm going, they couldn't get it going the entire day. And that's a huge problem. When you're going up against good teams, you're going to have certain drives where you don't get points. And you're going to have certain drives where you go 3 and out. And that's totally fine, but you have to find ways to get your rhythm back to go out there and put up points on your 2nd, 3rd, 4th drives. You look at their game against San Francisco earlier on this year, where they had no momentum early, and then they had a decent drive, and then afterwards they had no rhythm the entire game. It felt like against good teams like Buffalo and Green Bay, that also hurt them as well. And I don't think it's a coincidence that their worst performances were against the best teams in the NFL. And I think that moving forward, rhythm starters are going to be a big key for the Dallas Cowboys' success. Because as much as I personally love Dak Prescott, he is not one of those quarterbacks who, when he's playing out of rhythm, can easily get back in rhythm. He's not a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen or a Joe Burrow. He's one of those guys who you got to give him quick, easy stuff to get his rhythm going so that ultimately he can play like that MVP quarterback we know he can. I personally think that Dak's best performances this year were against the LA Rams, the New York Giants, and the Philadelphia Eagles. And in those 3 games, he got his rhythm going early, and when that happened, he was basically unstoppable. So in my opinion, when Dallas is going up against those really good teams and they need to find a way to get their rhythm going, I think they need to rely on their running game and give Dak Prescott some easy looks so that he can get his rhythm started. Because to me, once Dak does get his rhythm going, he's one of those quarterbacks that you genuinely don't want to see him be at that level because he's so damn good. I think if they can get those plays figured out, that could be a huge addition from this offense that can really help them out in those games where they're starting off a little bit slow. But all in all, the Dallas Cowboys have a lot of things they need to fix this offseason. Thus far, I don't really have any big opinions on Mike Zimmer becoming their defensive coordinator, and I don't really know how to feel about Mike McCarthy remaining the head coach and, of course, offensive mind. I think moving forward, that is going to be something we have to monitor, and I also think that their leash, in terms of how long they have going forward, is very short. If Mike McCarthy comes out next year and they suck, he'll be gone.